Welcome to another episode of This Catholic Life. Conversations about life's ups and downs, big and small, how we deal with every situation imaginable, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical, and joyful. Today's show is The Year It All Changed, a conversation about how the world changed so radically in 1968, the good and the bad aspects, and why we should care about it now. Because frankly, who cares about 1968? I doubt that any of us, in fact, I'm absolutely certain that none of us here were born at that time. I'm saying that in a nice way. I'm your host, Peter Holmes, and today I'm joined by Tom Gourlay and Daniel Matthys, co-editors of the recently published 1968 Culture and Counterculture, a Catholic Critique. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much for having us.
Before we get started, just a reminder to the listener, if you like the show, you should subscribe on your podcast app, and that way you won't miss an episode. Now, this book, as I understand it, is a proceeds of a conference which had over 30 speakers and all went over to Perth, which is impressive in itself, the most isolated capital in the world. 30 speakers, including some very impressive names, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. But to sum it up, I wanted to cite an ABC religion reporter, and I know that's fairly rare on this podcast to cite the ABC, but the ABC religion reporter who said at the conference, "I have never been to a conference like this one. Rather than being negative or disengaged in the face of such vast and epoch-changing events, here, hands were shooting up and the audience seemed to have an average age of about 35. That was fairly glowing praise of the conference there from someone from the ABC in particular. Firstly, the conference was organised by the Dawson Society. Let's take a step back and ask perhaps Daniel to give us a little bit of an opening on who the Dawson Society are and what they do.
Yeah, sure. So the Dawson Society, we first had discussions about putting together some sort of group that would encourage intellectual engagement, particularly from lay Catholics. I think it was in 2012. We were sitting in an Irish pub over a pint of Guinness. And
that's a good place for Catholics to start things.
Absolutely, it is. We basically, it was Tom, myself, and I think Elizabeth's Tom's wife, was there as well. And we basically said, look, there's a lot of things happening in the Perth Archdiocese when it comes to faith and sort of pious works and charity and that sort of thing. What is missing a little bit, particularly if you're not currently engaged in a form of study, is a serious engagement in intellectual life from Catholics. And we basically said, well, if we don't do something about it, then it probably doesn't get done. So let's put something together.
Now, hang on, I've just got to go back on one of those details there. Tom, you weren't married to your wife at the time.
No.
Are you sure this wasn't just some elaborate ploy to get married?
Well, look, I refuse to confirm or deny.
Well, at least part of the exercise was successful. You're happily married now. And
that's exactly right, yeah.
What happened next?
Daniel and I had been reading a lot of different stuff at the time. G.K. Chesterton was always in the mix. But there was already a G.K. Chesterton Society in Australia and doing wonderful work. And we were looking broadly, and one of the authors that we had been reading and continue to read is that of the English historian Christopher Dawson. Christopher Dawson has written a whole, libraries of work, I suppose. Yeah, lots and lots of books. But we were really interested in his kind of understanding of history and culture, and how really the most dynamic element in history is the spiritual element. So what we found interesting is how he could look at big historical events or epochs in history, and tease out from that the spiritual kind of movements in history, and show how the big things that were happening were kind of the result of spiritual movements and impacted on spiritual movements. That becomes the kind of key through which he looks at history. And so
now, when you say spiritual movements, can we take a pause there and talk about what we mean there? Do you mean like a particular philosophy? Because some people might describe things in terms of political philosophies, or maybe the zeitgeist or the general feeling of a particular era. But you're talking about a spiritual thing here, and that's quite an interesting take. If Dawson takes this, how does he define what a spiritual movement is?
Probably the best book to look at would be Progress in Religion by Dawson, for this, and it's been a couple of years since I last read it, so I don't want to necessarily go down as being the Dawson expert or anything like that. But the way that Dawson would look at it as a Catholic historian, as a historian, he would, same as any sort of his secular counterparts, look at the social, the economic, the political forces. But as a Catholic historian, he's also aware that there are spiritual forces and spiritual dynamics at play. And to ignore the spiritual and just to focus on the social, the economic, and the political would be harmful to the history. You're right. Just as if you were just purely Catholic and just sort of looking at spiritual forces and you ignored stuff like the economic or the social background or the geography even of the scene. So for Dawson, his critique of the way that history had been written up to that point was it was highly materialistic, and that critique was not to say that the materialism is wrong, but to say that it's missing an extra element. And his whole sort of approach is to try and add this element into the discussion. And we like that approach, and that's why we basically said that's the approach we want for our discussions, for our conversations, for our conferences.
Is his contribution then that materialism, or the idea that this wealth and physical pleasure or whatever it is the only thing that matters, that he's more anti that by bringing in something that there's a deeper dimension to human existence and to morality and all those kinds of things? Is that one way of describing it?
I wouldn't say anti. I would just say he sees that as insufficient. It doesn't capture the whole of what's happening, and he wants to look. Okay. He thinks that if you include the spiritual and actually see that as somewhat primary, then you actually get a bigger vision of what's actually unfolding.
So it sounds like that way of looking at the world isn't limited to this period of time. It's going to be something we need those kind of glasses on as we're looking at any part of history.
Particularly, and that's why we took Dawson, not because we wanted to be a Christopher Dawson fan club. We actually look at him more as an inspiration for how we approach things. So
right.
we've hosted a number of lectures in the pub or cultural events, musical things, and the conference was a bit of a high watermark for us. The idea really is to look at or to take Dawson's vision of history and culture and use that to inform how we approach things.
It sounds like your next conference is going to be titled the Dawson Hermeneutic.
Perhaps, yeah.
Now let's come back to the conference. 1968 was chosen. Now, quite often in these cases, conferences tend to focus on a particular, as you mentioned, they either focus very much on Catholic theology, on something that was happening in Catholic theology, or they focus on a particular event and our interpretation of it. A lot happened in 1968, and that seemed to be kind of the point of your conference, that there was so many things happening at once that it's impossible to take them all, to take them individually.
Yep. Yeah. Well, when we sat down to plan a conference, we were thinking, oh well, this year 2018. Actually, it's the 50th anniversary of Pope Paul VI Humanae Vitae. That's a pretty significant event, and how it was received, and how it spawned a whole range of different things, including John Paul II's theology of the body, and which has been a big impact, has had a big impact on our lives, and a whole range of other things. But we thought, look, that gets very, very, very narrow, very quick, and let's see what else was happening. And when we started just quick search around on the internet or looking through things, we discovered that there was a heck of a lot that actually was unfolding in 1968, and it was kind of a epochal change. There was something that was really significant that was happening, and so again, in the spirit of Dawson, we thought, why don't we try and take a holistic look at things, and in a way that is not trying to be unpartisan, trying to actually look at things in a way that's not ideological. So to not have quick, easy, either affirmations of everything that unfolded or quick, easy kind of condemnations of things that unfolded, but to really take a good critical look to be able to sift it and see what's good, what should we learn from this that is good to take forward, and what should we actually somewhat repudiate. And so that was how we approached it.
I would add to that 1968 is a year that inspires sort of strong emotional reactions, both from the left and the right. From the right, it's sort of the year of the sexual revolution, where everything started to go downhill, started to go wrong. On the left, it's a big moment when sort of the youth of America and other Western countries stood up, and change was in the air. Times are changing. All that sort of aspect.
Well, Woodstock was 69, wasn't it?
It was, August 69.
But probably planned in 1968, though, I'm sure.
And that's what you'll see. If you read through the book, you'll see that it's kind of a little bit blurry. People are contextualizing what the event that happened in 68 and then looking at how it kind of moves into the future.
But you've got, as you said, you've got Humano Vitae dropping in 68. You've got worldwide kind of culture shock, basically, and there's the opposition to the Vietnam War. There's world events around the place, which still have impact today. We saw and one of the essays dealt with quite violent protests and reactionary elements in Europe, if I'm correct. And international terrorism became a kind of a thing before it was mostly localized. What we now call cultural Marxism, or some of us do. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I thought was a big deal, was the kind of the rise of psychology as a kind of a way of thinking about the world. I mean, psychology existed before then, but this kind of almost way of looking at the world through pure psychology seemed to be just sort of on the rise then.
Yes. Yeah, there's a great paper in the book by Dr. Wanda Skaraska, who's I think she's in Sydney. On exactly that. We were really surprised. Not surprised, we were edified, I suppose, by the diversity of the papers that came forward. When we put out a call for papers, we were so excited by the papers that came forward, and we're really thrilled with what's in the book now.
Well, I mean, as I said, the actual lineup is very impressive, and I'm just sort of looking at a vague list of names here. They deal with very significant writers like Rana, Curran, Ratzinger. Some people might have heard of him, Kaufman. And at the same time, looking at Germaine Grisey and Judith Butler and some of the big movers in the sexual revolution and especially in feminism, in the second wave, isn't it? By then,
that's right. Yeah.
Feminism,
yes,
and of course, the outcomes of the sexual revolution start to become obvious. But is this kind of breadth what you had in mind, or did any of these topics surprise you?
I mean, I would say this is exactly what we were after, not in the sense that we had a comprehensive idea of these are all the papers we want, but in the sense that we deliberately selected a topic that would be broad, that would draw people from all sorts of different disciplines under that sort of Dawson approach, that Dawson hermeneutic, if you like. And so we were thrilled. I mean, I will also say there are still gaps. We're not going to pretend that we've managed to encapsulate the entire year in a volume. And in a sense, we never really set out to do that, but we did set out to be as broad as we possibly could.
It does seem like there's a part 2 coming up, doesn't it? Because as you mentioned, I think even in your introduction, you mentioned the civil rights movement, assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the Cold War, Vietnam War, second wave feminism. These aren't addressed explicitly in the book, but there's no shortage of things addressed in the book.
Certainly, and I think one of the things, whether we ever get around to doing a second volume, I'm not 100% sure. But I think what we're hoping from a volume like this is to model an approach, I suppose, a way of looking at a year like 1968. And to be quite frank, I'm sure that in 50 years' time, people would be having a similar conference about 2020. To try and see how things unfold, how they're connected, the various interconnections of events, but also trying to see things not merely through the lens of political power or economic injustice or whatever, but to really try and see how things are shaped by people's experience.
Right. So what sort of things would you say? I mean, we're talking, the average listener here is going to be thinking, why do I care about 1968? What is it about 1968 that still has an impact today? And how would me analysing it now or looking at it now through someone else's eyes perhaps help me understand where I am today?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna list a couple of different examples, and this will be true for a number of different things. But look, Humano Vitae has come up so many times. I think that you in a sense have to start there. Humana Vitae is still something that the Catholic Church is coming to grips with. It's still probably just as controversial today as it was 50 years ago when it was first published. And we've got some really awesome papers, I think, that just contextualize Humana Vitae, but also draw connections between Humana Vitae to some of the other wider cultural movements that are going on. So in that
just
vein,
to be clear to the listener, Humana Vitae is Latin for human life, and it is an encyclical by Pope Paul VI released in 1968, which dealt with artificial contraception. And it's known for that, but actually what it dealt with was married love, really.
Precisely. And I think that's what is often missing. And one of the interesting things about some of the papers in the book and the papers that were presented at the conference was that it doesn't just get into the nitty-gritty of the moral theology. It actually talks about people were addressing the specific reactions and the fallout from those reactions. And sometimes those reactions were from whole conferences of bishops or from very, very prominent theologians. And what is the impact on that response for the lay faithful more broadly in the church, and how has that shaped the church into where we are now? And
something you said before, Tom, it made me ring a bell with me in the sense of looking at 2020 in 50 years' time, we might see it, but partially looking through your book and looking at something 50 years ago, 52 now. Gives us the lens to look at this year and go, well, hang on, we're not quite, we think it's so bizarre this year, or the one that's just gone. And especially in the church, there's been so much turmoil especially in the States and in relation to religion and how it deals with politics and all that kind of thing. And we think, oh, this is completely unprecedented. But in 1968, almost instantly when Humana Vitae came out, there was full-page ads put in by Catholics against it in American papers. So it's not unprecedented. It's very much precedented that Catholics get involved in arguing with each other out in public, and we've seen the fruits, if you like, and they're not good fruits either.
Yeah, precisely. And one of the things that I think, there's a really interesting paper in the book by a friend of ours, Professor John Kinder. He teaches Italian language at the University of Western Australia. He wrote a really fascinating paper about a Catholic priest, Luigi Giussani, who founded one of the new ecclesial movements, Communion and Liberation. But in '68, this burgeoning movement that Giussani had founded had lots and lots of young adults really, really involved, who all wanted to get involved in the student protest movement. And Giussani's whole approach to that was really trying to just call them back to their faith in the person of Jesus, and to really encourage them to not weaponize the faith, to not say, okay, because we're Catholic, we have to take this particular political stance. What it actually meant for him and the movement was that, thousands of young people left the movement, and he was left with very few people in the end. But he was, I suppose, trying to actually encourage people to be adults in the faith, to actually
it sounds stand awful up, like Jesus and the disciples, to Lord, to whom shall we go?
well, precisely, actually, and I think looking at the experience of that one person, Father Giussani, in 1968, actually gives us a real. I think it's a really fascinating approach to this. One of the papers that I was really, really most pleased with, because while it doesn't necessarily look at those big seismic shifts that were happening culturally, it gives us a sense of one particular person's experience in trying to follow Christ in the midst of what seems to be just tremendous turmoil.
That's one of the things we say in the opening part of the show. We attempt to deal with life, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical, and joyful. Now, this year has really tried us out on that range. This last year, but looking at the papers, you could say that 1968 and other. I mean, there's obviously many times in history where you could pick out sort of cultural climaxes and cruxes. But these years give us an insight into what kind of behavior, what kind of insights, what kind of activity ends up bearing the most fruits. And it seems as if I mean, surprise, surprise, it seems as if being a saint matters. Having someone come through and actually act in patience, in obedience, in genuine submission to God's will, it seems to bear the good fruits, whereas the political activism, no matter how well motivated, ends up bearing not so great fruits.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. That it takes sometimes 50 years, sometimes more, for those fruits to become apparent. And that was one of the nice things of picking, in a sense. As you said at the start of the show, none of us were around in 1968, and it's almost a bit presumptuous to say we're going to analyse that year that none of us were even a part of. But sometimes it takes that long to actually to see the fruits of a year like that. So in a sense, we talk about 2020. I think it will take 50 years before someone can accurately look at 2020 and say, this is what came out of that and this is what didn't. And there are a lot of people at the moment who are basically taking their favourite hobby horse and they're saying, because of COVID, this will happen. And it's like, oh, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Let's find out in probably 50 years.
Yeah, I think you're right with that. And I think one of the things I noticed about 1968 is that there's so much focus on certain events, which are quite big and, they've had a visible impact, that some of the other events that people mentioned, I thought, actually, that's a much, like the psychology one for me, that was totally. A much, much more significant thing. And it's been pervasive through our culture in a way that perhaps the debate about Humanae Vitae hasn't quite been as well, I don't know. That's an argument we can have sometime.
No, but I think one of the other interesting things, and this came out in a paper by Dr. Matthew Tan, is to be able to look at phenomena like Matt looks at some of the Frankfurt School philosophers who, in many circles, are kind of brushed aside as cultural Marxists and there's nothing good here. But Matt's approach, which actually I think is exemplified by Father Giussani, as we were talking about, is to try and look at these things free of ideological lenses and say, okay, what actually can we do here? Like what's true here? What's true? What's good? What's beautiful here? And actually sift it out. So there's no easy answer to say these people are wholly good and these people are wholly bad.
Yeah.
To really sit back and try and...
Yeah, often reactionaries have a point. One thing, I mean, I'm an ex-Lutheran minister, and when I looked at Luther's stuff, it made a lot of sense because what he was reacting to was true. Like there was problems in the church, and there were problems in the church, and there were sort of turmoil and mismanagement and all kinds of things like that. And we shouldn't be imagining ourselves to be in the only part of history where that happens.
And I'll add to that as well. We have a paper by Philip Amata on the Stonewall riots, which obviously are a major milestone in sort of LGBT history. And again, it's a reaction to police brutality and other things that were going on in 1968 and in that era, which is insufficient from a Christian perspective. And that's actually...
That was a reality. I mean, I grew up in the country, but that was a reality when I grew up. I mean, I've gone back. I didn't know at the time because people used to mumble things about gay bashing, for example, when I was in high school. And I thought they were just the usual bravado in which they bragged about the size of various parts of their body. But when I went back and looked in history, there were several murders of people who, were identified as gay and put themselves in certain positions. And it was a horrible time. And so you can understand, if you like, the reaction of it. But can I come back to something G.K. Chesterton said? He said, a reformer is almost always right about what is wrong, but wrong about what is right.
Yes.
And so lots of these reactions are legitimate reactions to legitimate problems. And yet the solution they propose isn't always the best solution. And part of it, they're falling into that fallacy of, we must do something, this is something, therefore we must do it, kind of thing.
Precisely, yeah.
And so what would you say, we've got to wrap it up soon, but what would you say are the key lessons coming out of this, apart from buy the book?
Well, yeah, I think first and foremost, I think you should buy the book. And actually, the book will be launched. We're having some launch events, one here in Perth on the 9th of February and one over in Sydney on the 10th of February. And there will be one in Melbourne later in February. We're just waiting for a few pieces of the puzzle to kind of come together. But I think there's, as far as things to learn from this is that I suppose that critical eye that the faith gives us the ability to kind of look at things in a more holistic way. What Benedict spoke of as a broadened reason, but one that actually can look at things and to really try and sift them, to see what's true and good and beautiful. And that actually helps us. It opens us up to actually a genuine dialogue with people who might be on the opposite side of every issue that we think is important from us, but to see what's motivating them, what area are we missing in our vision? What's our blind spots?
Yeah. And also, if they've got a legitimate complaint, it's not good enough to say your answer's no good. We should be thinking about what's a better answer. What's an answer that doesn't do what we don't want it to do. The other point to make is that you don't have to live in Perth to be in the Dawson Society, do you?
Well, look, the Dawson Society operates as a kind of a vehicle for us to organise events. We put all of our things available. All our recorded lectures are available via podcasts. We've got a website that you can get all sorts of stuff that we've generated or facilitated over the last few years since we started in 2012. So for the
listener, we'll throw that website in the show notes so you can check it out there.
And we're on Facebook and Twitter and those types of things as well. So
excellent. All right. What would you say personally is the biggest thing that's come out of the whole experience, not just of the conference itself, but hearing the papers, editing them, and the book now on the shelves?
I think the biggest thing to come out of the book for me is the interest that there was both in the broader community and in sort of academic domains to come together for a conference like this. I think it was fantastic that we had such a broad array of people coming and really sort of listening and engaging. And that for me has been the thing that I've really taken away from this, and it's sort of encouraged us in what we're doing. And hopefully we'll be back with something similar in the future.
Yeah, and look, I was so edified by not only the responses of those who contributed papers to the conference and later to the book, but also the community here in Perth who supported it. The University of Notre Dame, Australia, supported us with the venue. The Knights of the Southern Cross here in WA supported us with providing some travel bursaries for scholars, particularly younger scholars from out east, to come and visit us in Western Australia and present their paper. But I think for me, it's the relationships that are built, not just at the conference, but following on from that via email and phone and now, thanks to 2020, Zoom conversations. Where
there really is no substitute for a personal meeting, is there?
No, it really isn't. But to be able to build off those personal meetings that happened at the conference, to put the paper together and to work on the edits and things like that, we were thrilled. We had Father Wojciech Giertek come from Rome. He's the theologian to the papal household, present a paper. Professor Tracy Rowland. And so just some really wonderful people who very magnanimously gave of their time and effort to come over to a few people from WA who decided to put together a conference like this to give, I suppose, put their trust in us to get to see this project through.
Yeah,
we're pretty edified by that. Yeah.
A quick shout out to Tracy Rowland, who's won an award which is effectively the Nobel Prize of Catholic theologians for the world recently, and she's no small name on that list either.
Yeah, precisely.
All right. Well, that's it for this week's podcast. If today's discussion got you thinking, which is precisely what the Dawson Society is interested in making you do, or arguing with your podcast device, let us know. You can subscribe at thiscatholiclife.com.au, or you can tell us what you like, didn't like, or what you want in the future by hitting us up on Twitter, Facebook, Discord, or Instagram, and you can find all the links that we mentioned in the show in our show notes on this site. Give us a review. Remember that this is a uniquely Australian Catholic podcast, and we think that's an idea worth getting behind. So tell your friends. We'll be back next week, but that's all for now. Thank you for listening to This Catholic Life.